dive right in, Shalene. I don't have a prepared introduction for you, although I also don't know where I would start with the resume that you bring to the table in terms of your experience in cannabis regulation and the equity and the conversations that you and I have had about them. So I will kind of let you take it away, and you can introduce yourself and kind of share your information and knowledge with us.
Great, great. Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to see you all. I think I know of all of you. I've only talked to Julie before. So I will give you a brief presentation, and then I'm really happy to answer questions. I mean, I think a lot of it will just be telling you how we did things in Massachusetts and letting you customize that. But I do want to give a big shout out to Vermont in particular. And the reason is since my term ended at the end of last year, I have shifted my focus to federal legalization and particularly worrying about what it's going to do to state programs and state equity programs. And one of the things I've been looking at is the model of actually just legalizing possession, just taking possession and limited cultivation out of the Controlled Substances Act and then taking it slow otherwise. And to my knowledge, Vermont is the only state to have done that, and it's great to have that model. So I have some slides that I asked Nellie to show for me if she could, because I'm scared of sharing my screen and I don't know how to do it. And I'll go through kind of what the best practices are. Thank you so much, Nellie. So this is what we know so far about cannabis and social equity, which is not any conclusions, but a lot of good information. So I'll just briefly introduce myself. So from 2017 to 2020, I served as commissioner of Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission. We have 5 commissioners. It's an independent agency, and we were appointed based on 5 different expertise areas, I think similar to you all. So mine was social justice. And I'm currently a visiting fellow at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at The Ohio State University. And I also vice chair the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition, which exists to do activities like this and make sure that you know that you are not alone and we are sharing everything that we've learned in other states that have done this first. So moving on to the next summary, big picture that we have, if we look at what has happened in other states, like I said, there's no conclusion, but we've gone a long way since 5 years ago when Massachusetts and California first attempted equity. And I just want to emphasize that we did not get it right the first time. It was a continuous process of listening, changing, figuring out what the challenges were, figuring out what the new challenges were after we had made changes, and then addressing them. But best practices are starting to emerge. Data is starting to look better. The top 3 takeaways, I think, are 1, you can't think of an equity program as a separate thing that you're doing. You have to build the foundation right first, or otherwise it will never work. The second thing is that when it comes to what the benefits are, what the eligibility is, how you define someone who was harmed by the drug war, I think there's no one right answer. I think the right approach to take is to make sure you're listening and that you are being very transparent about it, but it's always going to be different for different states. And then, of course, like I said, keep planning in advance to making adjustments. And I think a part of that is being clear. We'll collect data, and then in 6 months, we'll have a listening session. I don't know if your statute has you go back regularly to discuss or recommend statutory tweaks, but if it does, I think you should plan for needing those. And then, of course, you're not alone. All of the other regulators are here to talk you through this because it's not easy. So let's start with that foundation. The first thing is making sure that you are understanding how big this question is, right? Like regulating cannabis in general is really difficult, but I think this is the most difficult aspect because how can we repair the harm that's done by the war on drugs? It has its tentacles in every single area of our lives. And so we're never going to be able to harm it unless we can do the exact same thing. And there's only so much you can do as a cannabis commissioner. So just understand your role in it. And I think acknowledging the harm that was done goes a long way. And then listening to people from impacted communities. In the beginning, when I started, the chairman of the commission, who was very different from me, like in pretty much every possible way, we kind of went on a little tour together of disproportionately impacted areas. And we talked to a lot of people about just broadly what their vision was, what do they see as the harm? What do they see as repairing the harm? And I found over time, he and I were very often on the same page. And no one else was. And I often look back and think it might have been because of those few days that we spent going on that tour and keeping up that communication. This is an important bullet point. It's helpful to think about equity in 3 different ways. The first way is stopping the harm. And I think that is where criminal justice measures are really important, making sure disparities don't continue, expungement, anything that has to do with the criminal justice system that's usually going to be out of the scope of business licensing. But I think it's important to acknowledge that piece of it. The second is reinvesting into communities. And that means if you are from a community that was harmed, it doesn't matter if you are interested in the industry or not, you should be getting benefits into your community. And typically in the newer states, and I'm sorry, I don't know how this is done in Vermont, but in the newer states, it's usually a percentage of revenue. 40, 50, 70% of tax revenue are the most recent figures that are directed via grants into disproportionately harmed communities. And then industry benefits. And I think that's what commissions like ours have the most control over. But it's really important to recognize that that's just one piece of equity. So on that note, creating a cohesive set of licensing frameworks, social equity programs, and workforce development to ensure meaningful participation. Meaningful participation happens to be the mandate that was in our statute. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what that means. And in our listening tours, our official ones, we heard a lot that there was no one size fits all. Some people wanted to be entrepreneurs. Actually, the vast majority of people who attended wanted to be entrepreneurs, but a lot of people wanted to be managers or move up in the industry or own ancillary businesses. And many wanted to just have entry or reentry programs. So we ended up creating all 4 of those as separate tracks in our equity program. So after thinking about how to approach it, this is the necessary foundational work. And this is, I think, the most key piece that gets missed a lot. And I liken it to if your social equity program is trying to help people to cross a bridge, but you have not built the bridge yet, your program is not going to work. So this part is building the bridge. Sequential licensing is extremely important. So I just finished up a project with the Ohio State University looking at different social equity programs and how they have fared. And I found that the thing that all of them had in common that made them not a success is the fact that no matter what was going on with the program that caused the challenges, while they were having challenges, the other bigger, usually established medical operators were able to open. And so a lot of that, I think, is due to the excellent advice to start small, right, and then go incrementally. And I think that's absolutely the way you should go. But you should start with those marginalized equity businesses first. And that is going to allow you to see the challenges. They are absolutely going to be unforeseen challenges that you'll need to address. And while you are doing that, you won't have other companies that are dominating the industry until it's too late, which is something that we have seen in a lot of places. Which brings me to my next bullet point. We got very lucky in Massachusetts because that's what happened, but we have a strict ownership limit where one person or entity cannot own or control more than 3 licenses of each type. And it's a lot of investment on the commission to examine those contracts and make sure that there are penalties if you don't, if you try to break the limits. I think that's actually something that's going on in Massachusetts right now. They're having a meeting with some pretty major enforcement penalties. And if you do that, then you have the room to make an equity program that works. Guidance for local officials. That is super important because they don't have the time that we have, to spend all our time thinking about this. And so what happens is they go through this default kind of path where it's not intentional racism, but it's systemic, that you were likely to go with the company that's going to approach you, that has experience, that has a great multi-state plan. They're ready to go, and you haven't even thought about equity, right? Because you're this very busy, city level official, and you're just trying to do what's right for your residents. And then you find out when it's too late that you haven't been equitable, and neither have, the hundreds of other cities. So doing that off the bat is really helpful, even just a model ordinance or any kind of guidance that you can give. Conscious staff hiring, really, really important. I think that the first hires that you make is probably the most important decision that you'll make in terms of how equity plays out, because it's something that you need to think about in every small decision. And commissioners can't control for that. You can only hire the right people who are going to hire the right people who are going to bake equity into everything you do. And then last, this is conceptual, but removing the barriers to entry as much as you can is, of course, going to reduce the capital that is needed, and in general, make it easier for everybody, but especially those who are disproportionately advantaged and for whom these barriers are more difficult than others. So, trying to make sure that all of your regulations are evidence-based, and that you're thinking about people who don't have a lot of resources. So that brings us to the big questions, designing an equity program. So the most common factors when you're defining how to identify someone as a disproportionately harmed person is arrests and convictions. That's the most direct way. Certainly, no matter where they're from or what their life is like, if they've had an arrest or conviction for marijuana, it has affected their life. And then residency is also very popular. The imperfect but common standard is to designate, based on arrest records and other similar statistics, areas of disproportionate impact geographically. And then if you can prove residency in 5 of the past 10 years, you qualify. So in Massachusetts, we have both of those, as well as if you can show that you have a parent or a spouse that had a drug arrest, then you qualify as an individual. And that gets you into the training programs. And then as a business, if you're majority owned by people who meet that criteria, then you get the business benefits. And then we also have less significant benefits if you're 10% or more owned by those people. So that we can encourage ownership as a type of compensation, but we're also differentiating between those who are majority owned and those who are not. So with the benefits, I can say over time, every program that has tried to do this has had more drastic benefits being added because we're not seeing it work, right? So it's like every year there is a higher floor for the minimum that you need to do for an equity program. I think the best one so far is Oakland, California. It's very comprehensive. And one thing they've done a great job is legal services, accounting services, other professional services for those applicants. In Oakland and in Boston, a few other cities, they have 50% of licenses set aside for people in the program. In Massachusetts, at the state level, we don't have any set number of how many businesses there will be. So instead, we set aside a license type, which is delivery and social consumption. And delivery has been implemented at this point. And our thinking there was that it's the lowest barrier type of license. So for the first 3 years, only if you are one of these designated businesses owned by the people who qualify, you can deliver. And then after 3 years, we set in advance a list of criteria for the commission to determine whether we've met the goals, because chances are it's going to be completely different commissioners at that point. So they look at the data, they decide, has this worked? If it hasn't, they continue it and maybe add even more benefits. If it has, then they let other businesses come in. The role of other non-social equity businesses, you're going to find a lot of different opinions on. My personal opinion is that the government is the one that has caused the harms by the war on drugs and the resources to fix it, and the one that works for the public. So I think that it makes sense for the government to be the one to fix the harms, but some states have a role for corporations. I think probably one of the best ones is what they have in Oakland, where you get a licensing benefit if you incubate a business by giving them part of your property. And that part is really important because property is probably, after capital, the most difficult barrier for applicants. It's very difficult to find one that's zoned properly. Once you do, the rent is going to be 10 times higher than it would otherwise. And so if you're an applicant and you can get some benefits from the state and then you can get property from another business, I think that's a really good combination. And then finally, I think evaluation and adjustment is something that can make and break your program, especially if you are clear with communication from the beginning. I think that's another thing we learned in Massachusetts is we set expectations really high, but people felt that it didn't work, overnight, and then we think we lost some credibility at that point. So I wish we had said, this hasn't worked very well in other states. We couldn't at the time because we were the first, but you could say, here's our plan. We're going to come back, in this many months and listen to your challenges and change our regulations, and just be clear about that from the beginning. That might be all my slides. Yes, so happy to take your questions now.
Thank you, Shalene. I really appreciate you taking the time. One of the things that I mentioned to you before was about trust. So, we're asking folks to come from a legacy market into a regulated market, and maybe they haven't had a great experience in the criminal justice system, or they've, intentionally operating outside of, a typical system. And it sounds like there are some ways to build trust. I wonder if the tour that you went on that you spoke about, was that an effort to build trust, or are there other things that, other commissions have done to build trust?
That's such a good question. I'm really glad that's what you're thinking about right now. We had both an official listening session and then kind of an unofficial tour. So the listening session was, of course, open to everybody, and we took care to put it in the areas where the people we were trying to reach were. And then we got yelled at, rightfully, because we did it during the day, during work hours. So it was like, okay, here's our first example of listening to you. We're going to hold another one, or we're going to hold it at night. And then a lot more people came. And then we talked to the people who are already doing the work, because I think if you are trying to make your own credibility, that's a lot more difficult than if you can connect with people who already have credibility, and you can show them, like, the first time you meet them, they have no reason to trust you. Why should they? But if they say, here are some things you can implement, and then you do it and you go back to them, that trust is going to eventually filter to you.
Great, thank you. Pepper, Kyle, Susanna, Nader, I'm not sure if you're still here. Any questions?
So let me just jump in if you don't mind. Shalene, thank you so much for being here. I just wanted to introduce Susanna Davis is our state of Vermont racial equity director, and she has been charged in our enabling legislation to help us define social equity applicant and develop some social equity programs. So we've asked her to join us as kind of an honorary board member today, just so that she can tap into your knowledge as well. And Nader Hashim is former representative, former state police, who really has led the effort in the legislature on criminal justice reform in a lot of different ways. And he was recently appointed by the Speaker of the House to be to our advisory committee in the capacity of a person with expertise in systemic social justice and equity issues. And so we also invited him here today because he'll be helping with this this piece of our work as well. And I would like to thank you for being here so much. I'd like to put a plug in for your Social Equity 2.0 webinar series. I look forward to those more than almost anything else that I listen to. And it really clued me into a few issues that I just was not aware of, and I'd like to ask you about, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So the one is related to the kind of community host agreements and local control, and how that impacts the ability to deliver on the social equity and economic empowerment promises that are in the legislation that we have, at least. And if you don't mind me kind of piggybacking on that, also another issue that you kind of cued me into in your conversations with in your first Social Equity 2.0 was around limiting predatory practices against social equity applicants, and kind of these lending agreements that maybe means that you're a 51% owner, but oh, by the way, you're actually taking loans from people that are amassing your profits, essentially. So if you wouldn't mind just speaking about those two issues, the kind of local control and the kind of predatory lending practices, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely, yeah. And thank you for watching those sessions. You were absolutely the target audience. I'm glad it was helpful. And I also wanted to say to Susanna that I saw, or at least I read a live tweeted thread of her last presentation. I thought it was excellent and very much on point. So, so yeah, these are two big red flags: host community agreements and predatory practices. So host community agreements in Massachusetts were meant to be an agreement between a business and a community that would cover things like signage and hours of operation and what a local community should control. And it would also allow the business to reimburse the city for any costs that came up, like traffic studies or extra security on opening day. But what happened was the cities ended up just charging whatever they wanted to the businesses, and over time, it's very much been abused, and it really prevented our equity program from succeeding. So I've thought a lot about this, and I think there are two ways you could go. And one is the legislative route and trying to make sure that at the very least, municipalities have the same consistent equity mandate as at the state level. And then also incentives on top of that. Maybe if it's something very small, like we have a 3% local tax, but if it was just 1% more of the state tax, which is another 17, if that was shifted to municipalities for each dollar that comes in to an equity business in a town, I think that would be really helpful. And the reason I phrase it that way is because there are 100 different barriers that take place that you can't predict until they actually open. And so once you get to that point where they actually open and you're getting the incentive at that point, now the municipalities have a reason to help versus, you trying to legislate every one of those barriers. That's one. But I know that everywhere, but especially in New England, it's very difficult to legislate that sort of balance. So instead, it would be so helpful if you just, to the extent you can, invest in providing guidance to the people who do want to help at the local level. And it might even be as simple as, helping one city to do it right, and then once they do it right, making sure that that model ordinance is available to everybody. And nonprofits at the local level, advocacy groups, they can really be helpful, as in getting people involved in the process. So if you can't reach the local officials, if you reach them through, their constituents, I've seen that be really successful here. But just thinking about it from the beginning, I think you're kind of ahead of the game. And of course, we can share, ordinances from Boston, Cambridge, Oakland, all of these places that have done it really well. So predatory practices, that's the other one. I think there's a difference between what's actually written right on the paper in terms of your regulations and then what's done in practice. And this was really key for us because we have that ownership limit, but we could have just taken it, at the letter of the law and said, well, if you're not, a written owner or a written, controller of this company, then, it's not a problem, and just let it go. And if we had done that, I think that none of our equity businesses would have actually been run by the people, who are purportedly running it. It took a lot of work to hire a contractor, an accounting firm, to check the contracts. And then also, this goes back to the trust that Julie was asking about, because you really need the businesses who are being approached with these practices to feel comfortable coming to you. And that's like, I think by far the way that we found out about this was the businesses would tell us, hey, this other company approached me and they offered me this. And sometimes, they're real slick about it. They'll like say, I won't talk to you unless we sign an NDA. And these companies really need capital, right? So they're incentivized to be part of this. They're not incentivized necessarily to come and tell, the government about it. But if you create that trust and you're very clear that you are going to enforce this, and you have to be the company that is actually running the company, that's clear. And then the one very important thing I will close with on that is you have to think about which party is going to be the one to face the consequences if this does happen. And if it's just that the smaller company loses their license, that's not really fair. So I would think about writing into your regulations that if you are a bigger company and you approach a smaller company with something that is attempting to circumvent the eligibility requirements for the equity program, then you would face penalties for that. And we have a lot of language written on that took years of refining that we can share with you.
Thank you.
Hi, Shalene. Kyle Harris here. It's great to meet you. And as James alluded to earlier, I'm a big fan of a lot of your work. I'm glad that you just mentioned consequences for this predatory atmosphere and who's actually responsible, because that's something that I'm continuously thinking about. You got my brain spinning in a good way when I looked at you described your multi-tiered equity program. I think that's really, really cool. And I'm interested to kind of dig in more to that and figuring out how we can right-size something like that for a state up here to help businesses or entrepreneurs or individual interested folks, depending on where they're at and what they're trying to accomplish. I had a question, and I recognize you worked for the state and not cities or municipalities in Massachusetts, but Boston setting aside, I think you said 50% licenses for social equity applicants. And you might not be at liberty to know too much about how they got to that number or the legal risk that Boston may be willing to take on. And we heard from Bo Kilmer, and we know that there's jurisdictions that are more hesitant than others on what words they use, describe things, so on and so forth. My only, and I'm not necessarily overly cautious. I want this to be a big part of what we're doing, but I also don't want to advise, I'll call them municipalities in Vermont and not necessarily cities based on our size, to go ahead and pursue some type of localized program like that, recognizing that it could open up a can of legal worms that they might not be equipped to really respond to in a way that will keep the integrity of what they're trying to do at a local level.
Absolutely. That's a great question. I can definitely speak to that because we spent a lot of time both at the state level and then helping out cities. So I think that what would be the most legally risky is if you have a specific licensing quota based on race, which is what Ohio did. Granted, at that time, we didn't have data on the industry, and now you have data on the industry. So I think it's a lot less risky now than it was back then, but it's still the most risky option. What we did was for our economic empowerment program, which is very similar to the equity program, we came up with 6 criteria, and one of them is Black and Latino descent specifically. And that was based on well-documented data that every state has that shows that the war on drugs has been disproportionately waged against those communities. But the other criteria were things like residency, arrests, and who you hired. So you could qualify in a variety of ways. And I think that's really the key question is, can you still qualify if you are not Black or Latino? And I think that helps lower your risk. The other thing that helps lower your risk is if you have a lot of evidence that this was based on data. So we commissioned a report, and then we just now, after several years, they commissioned another report. We had a lot of discussion about it in public. So if anyone questions, how we came up with those areas or those races, they'll be able to do it. In some places, it's indigenous populations as well, depending on what it looks like. The other thing I want to note is that in Cambridge, they only allowed economic empowerment applicants for the first 2 years, and medical operators in the state did sue, and it was eventually dropped after a backlash. But before it was dropped, there was a motion for summary judgment that was denied, and it did suggest that the state's program was going to be held up because it was not a race quota. So I think it's important to, I'll just quickly recap. So you should be able to qualify in ways other than race. It should be well documented. That's it.
Thank you so much.
I have more but Susanna Notter.
I don't, and I'm actually, I have to jump because I'm late for a different board meeting, but I just wanted to say, Shalene, thank you so much. This has been really, really insightful, insightful. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And thank you to the board for inviting me.
Reach out to me anytime if I can be helpful.
I just wanted to also say thanks, and some of my thoughts were mostly swirling around the predatory practices, which has been discussed at length. So I don't want to beat a dead horse or anything like that. But thank you.
Sure. I can add one more thing on that. We found, when I was talking to regulators in other places, we found that people were trying the exact same approaches here in California, Illinois, that I would have otherwise never known about if the regulators in those places hadn't told me. So it's good to be in contact about that too.
So I had a question. Just our legislation kind of demands that we move very quickly. We were supposed to kind of be sat on a specific day, and then within 4 weeks have an executive director, and then within 2 months have the whole structure of the market figured out, and then go through a flawless rulemaking process, all kind of trying to go to a specific date where we had to open kind of our retail stores. We are behind schedule pretty significantly. And I'm just wondering, I know Massachusetts was behind schedule a little bit as well. And I'm wondering how these sort of aggressive deadlines that are kind of expected of the board. I know, you had a ballot initiative, which kind of set the date where you all were supposed to get going. But how do these aggressive deadlines impact social equity applicants and our ability to kind of deliver on these social equity kind of undergirdings of our statute?
Without question, those are opposing forces, because the faster you go, the more you need to default to systemic things already in place that already favor big corporations and do not favor equity businesses. So anything that you can do to make sure that it's the equity businesses that open first, even if that takes longer, is really going to help. And I know at the time, it is not you. The legislation windows that they put out are just totally unrealistic. And I know at the time I was trying to balance those forces. If I could go back, I would have said it's a matter of a few months, and it is a matter of future generations that are counting on us, just like with alcohol prohibition. So, everybody can just calm down for a few months. I wish I had said that more.
Yeah, we don't have a general counsel yet. We don't have an executive director yet. I'm trying to, use my whatever platform I have right now to hopefully try and reset expectations and kind of get people to realize that, it's not, if the legislation calls for us to prioritize social equity applicants and to provide services for them, we got to make sure those services are available and that we can actually deliver on some of that and not just focus so squarely on the deadlines that are in our legislation.
Right. This is more of a messaging thing than a policy thing, but I often found that in the public discussion, the business profits and the rights of consumers would get conflated. and people would act like if the stores weren't open, people were still being arrested, and that's not the case. Like stopping arrest is an immediate need, but businesses making money is not.
Yeah. I think it also somewhat ties into the piece that you did about sequential licensing, and maybe you weren't talking about this, but offering, making sure that people that are cultivating have a place to process and test, and then, a retail operation, and making sure that, we're aware of the grow cycle versus how long it takes to actually set up a retail operation, and how long, the testing is going to take, and whether we have the capacity to even test.
I'm making a note to add that to when I talk about the sequential licensing, because I think we kind of dropped the ball on that. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, thank you. Yep. It makes us nervous a little bit. Yep.
Yeah. I think Nader has a question.
Thank you. One thought just popped into my head, kind of onto a different track, regarding arrests after commercialization. I was wondering if you found that people who were using marijuana, I don't know if you have this data in front of you, but if people who were using cannabis were still finding themselves being arrested or investigated for other issues, so I'm trying to find out how to phrase this the best way, but people who were using cannabis getting investigated because they were using cannabis, even though it was legal at the time, and being investigated for other crimes. Sorry if I didn't articulate that very well, but if that makes any sense.
No, you articulated that perfectly well. Yeah, I don't have the data in front of me, but I can tell you from my personal knowledge and memory, because we do have a research department that under our statute had to research these issues and do reports and present them to the commission and the public. So I would say no for that part, and not because of us or the law, but because we have, in my opinion, an excellent Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts that does not allow things like the odor of marijuana to be used for arrests. And of course, after legalization, possession arrests went down. You couldn't profile people that way. And I don't know any way that continued. But what we did see was, in terms of trafficking, distribution, the disparities either stayed the same or they got worse. And police training did not fix that, and legalization did not fix that. So I would say that it didn't fix the profiling, but it did stop the arrests and anything that would be based on possession or consumption arrests.
So did I hear that the kind of enforcement of the illicit market, the kind of distribution and the trafficking increased in Massachusetts following kind of the opening of retail stores? No?
No, the disparities, the racial disparities did. So it was still disproportionately Black and Latino people who were being arrested for that, and maybe at a higher rate. And that reports on the commission website. As far as enforcement of the illicit market, there was actually a concerted lobbying effort by the legal dispensaries to crack down on the illicit market. And I think the general consensus was that was absolutely premature, and that was really unfair to legacy operators that did not have a pathway to the legal market yet. And once you create that pathway, then you can start thinking about enforcement.
Other question? I have so much to think about right now. Any other questions from our group?
No, I mean, I know you offered Susanna, but I mean, are you available as a resource kind of offline if things come up?
Yeah. There's nothing better I could do with my time, honestly, that I could think of. So absolutely, yes.
Yeah, thank you for that offer. I think after all our presentations, but especially hearing from you and Bo, my head is swimming with ideas that I hope are good ones, but recognizing that people have probably had those ideas in other states, and some have been great and some have not worked out as envisioned. So,
well, I will leave you with this. first, you might want to go to the Mass Cannabis Control Commission website and just browse through those reports. They're like hundreds of pages long, but they'll spark these ideas. And then the second thing is, do not be afraid to innovate and experiment, because I mean, a lot of this stuff, you know, Colorado 10 years ago said 6 plants, so we said 6 plants, but it's a completely arbitrary number, right? So someone just made things up, so you should feel free to make things up too. See how it goes.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.